Rockefellers were not just rich. Anyone can be rich. What they built was something else, something invisible, a way to shape how a society thinks, not through force, not through fear, through education, through medicine, through philanthropy that did not heal, but defined what it means to be good, healthy, moral, normal. Their empire was not made of oil. It was made of belief. Before we continue, a brief clarification. This documentary does not promote, condemn, or advocate any political, ideological, or institutional position. All information presented is sourced from publicly available records, historical archives, academic research, foundation reports, and documented institutional history. What you hear is an interpretation of how these structures may be understood. You are not asked to accept it. You are not asked to agree. You are encouraged to verify independently and verify twice. Interpretation remains yours. Draw your own conclusions. John D. Rockefeller did not build power by producing more. He built it by producing less. He understood something simple and terrifying. People do not fear abundance. They fear scarcity. If you control how much of something exists, you don't just control the market. You control behavior. When oil became the lifeblood of industry, Rockefeller didn't try to own every drop. He learned where the bottlenecks were, the refineries, the distribution, the rail lines. He didn't have to control everything, only the parts no one else could live without. This wasn't business. It was system architecture. And once he understood how to control scarcity in oil, he began to wonder, what else could be made scarce? Ideas? Knowledge? The definition of what society considers true? The empire was never about fuel. It was about dependence. Standard Oil was never just a company. It was a blueprint. While others were fighting over markets, Rockefeller built something larger. A network of refineries, transport lines, supply contracts, and quiet agreements made behind closed ledgers. Competitors didn't lose because they were weaker. They lost because they were predictable. Rockefeller didn't outwork them. He outweighted them. He offered deals that looked like mercy, right up until they became dependency. And once dependency formed, power no longer needed to be loud. It simply existed, everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time the government understood what Standard Oil had become, it was already too late. The company wasn't just large, it was structural, a skeleton built into the economy itself. Breaking it apart was supposed to destroy the empire. But empires built on scarcity don't disappear when you cut them. They multiply. When the U.S. government announced the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, it sounded like a victory. The end of a monopoly, the restoration of competition, the triumph of fairness over control. That was the story. But the archive tells another version. Standard Oil didn't collapse. It rearranged itself. Dozens of companies, all controlled by the same core shareholders, all tracing back to the same ledgers, the same signatures, the same silent boardrooms. The empire didn't die. It dispersed, like ink dropped into water. It didn't need to be visible anymore. Visibility was the problem. Breaking the company reduced attention. But attention was the only threat. Control remained intact, quiet, distributed, everywhere. And once Rockefeller understood that power did not need a single throne, he stopped trying to rule markets. He began to consider how to shape something much larger, the way a nation thinks. Oil was power. But oil had limits. Markets could shift. Wells could run dry. And power that depends on extraction is power that can be challenged. Rockefeller understood something most industrial giants never learned. The most stable resource is not material, it is mental. If you can shape how a society learns, you shape how it thinks. And when you shape how it thinks, you never have to force it to obey. It will obey itself. So the empire turned, quietly, smoothly, almost gracefully, from pipelines to school boards, from rail networks to university endowments, from refineries to curriculum committees. A new kind of power emerged, power that didn't look like power anymore, not industry, ideology, the kind that does not need to convince, only to define. Before Rockefeller money entered American education, schools were different from one town to another. Each community taught what it believes mattered: local history, craftsmanship, philosophy, faith, trade. Education was identity. Then came the General Education Board, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Its stated mission was to improve teaching quality, but improvement required uniformity. Curriculums were rewritten. Local subjects were removed. Textbooks were standardized. And slowly, the classroom stopped being a reflection of the community and became a production line. The goal was no longer to develop a person. The goal was to produce a citizen who thinks in expected patterns, interprets the world in approved language, and does not question the frame itself. Here is what that looked like in real life. A teacher in a small town in Illinois once taught local agricultural methods, history of the region, and family trade skills. After the reform, her curriculum was replaced with national standardized lessons written in a city she had never seen by people she had never met. She did not lose her job, but she lost the right to decide what knowledge is. The classroom remained the same. The children remained the same. Only the mind behind the lesson changed. That is how influence works when it does not want to be noticed. It does not remove, it redefines. Before the early 20th century, medicine in America was not singular. There were multiple schools: herbal, holistic, osteopathic, homeopathic, community-trained, university-trained. It was not uniform. It was diverse. Then came the Flexner Report in 1910, funded in part by the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations. Officially, it aimed to improve medical quality, and it did. But improvement required standardization. Medical schools that aligned with the new model received funding, accreditation, legitimacy. Those that did not closed. Hundreds of institutions disappeared in less than a decade. Entire medical traditions vanished from public legitimacy, not because they were disproven, but because they were no longer considered modern. Here is what that meant on the ground. A community doctor in Ohio who once treated neighbors using a mix of herbal remedies, heat therapy, and observation found that his license was no longer recognized. His practice wasn't shut down with force. It was shut down with definition. Unscientific, unapproved, not standard. After the reform, medicine became one voice. A diagnosis was a category. A treatment was a protocol. And the patient became a case. Efficiency increased. Consistency improved. But something subtle changed. Health was no longer what made a person feel whole. Health became whatever the system defined as correct. And when a system defines what is correct, it quietly defines how people are allowed to live. When power wants to disappear, it does not hide. It brightens. Philanthropy is not just generosity. It is narrative. John D. Rockefeller gave away more money than any industrialist in history. Universities, libraries, medical schools, and the world saw charity, kindness, redemption. The story became simple. A titan learned humility. But charity has a second purpose. It shapes memory. It tells future generations who someone was, and more importantly, who they were supposed to be. Philanthropy creates an image that cannot be argued with. You can criticize a monopoly. You cannot criticize a donation. And so the empire did not vanish. It simply changed its clothing. Oil became education. Education became trust. Trust became immunity. And power, once visible, became beloved. The most effective influence is the kind no one wants to question. When the Rockefeller Foundation began funding universities, it did not dictate what to think. It shaped where thinking happens and which thinking is considered serious. One of the most influential beneficiaries was the University of Chicago, founded with Rockefeller endowment support. Over time, it became home to what would later be known as the Chicago School of Economics, a framework that shaped modern markets, government policy, and global development models. Not through force, through curriculum. Ideas taught to students became policies implemented by governments, became doctrines used by international institutions. And because the ideas originated in a university, they were considered neutral. But neutrality is never neutral when one worldview becomes the standard of credibility. Here is what this looked like at the human scale. A student in Kansas in the 1950s wanted to study agriculture, but the scholarship that brought him to the University of Chicago led him instead into economics, learning models of market behavior designed thousands of miles away from the land his family worked. He returned home not with skills for the soil, but with a language for optimizing labor, consolidating land, and increasing yield efficiency. His community didn't change because they were told to change. It changed because the language of value changed. Economics became identity. Progress became measurement. And one day, without announcement, the world adopted a worldview that had no single author and no single signature. Power was no longer a person. It was the environment of thought itself. When power is young, it shows itself. It builds towers, prints newspapers, signs its name on steel. But as power matures, it learns something else. Visibility is vulnerability. A name can be challenged. A face can be questioned. But a system has no face to confront, no voice to silence, no throne to overthrow. And so the Rockefeller empire stopped being a family and became an environment, influence embedded in foundations, trusts, universities, medical boards, development agencies, global councils. Not commanding, guiding. Not ruling, shaping. Influence so subtle that it feels like the natural order of things. When a worldview becomes invisible, it becomes reality. And the greatest power of all is the power no one remembers to question. Every age chooses its heroes, but only the powerful choose their legacy. John D. Rockefeller donated more to public institutions than any industrialist of his era. Hospitals, universities, public libraries, and the world saw generosity. It was a comforting story, a titan who conquered industry, then discovered humility. But public memory is not an archive. It is a mirror, and a mirror reflects what it's given to reflect. Philanthropy did more than restore reputation. It created a moral shield. If a man funds hospitals, who questions the system that defines illness? If a man builds universities, who examines the worldview they reproduce? And if society is taught to feel grateful, who would dare ask what gratitude protects? The myth of the good billionaire is not about goodness. It is about immunity. Influence that looks like virtue cannot be opposed, and power that cannot be opposed does not need to speak. Names fade, faces pass, but systems persist. The Rockefeller legacy did not endure because heirs guarded it carefully. It endured because the structures created no longer require guardians. Education standardized, medicine standardized, expertise centralized. Once these frameworks were in place, power no longer needed a signature. It simply flowed along the channels already built. You can remove a ruler, but you cannot remove the shape of the room that ruler designed. Eventually, the name becomes irrelevant because the environment is doing the work on its own. You've seen the structure now. It doesn't ask for belief. It only asks to remain unnoticed. So the question is simple. Now that you can see it, will you look away? Next story drops Wednesday.